All the yagnas for Trump and the campaigns with slogans like Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar has finally yielded 50% tariffs, among the steepest in any nation. And it seems it has already started hurting the manufacturing heartlands. From textiles in Tirupur to garments in Punjab, from cotton farmers in Vidarbha to auto part industries, there are apprehensions all around. Of course, we must talk back to Trump, and it is high time that we do. But questions also arise as to why did we not see this coming? Why were we filling stadiums with shows like Namaste Trump? Also, what are we doing now? The tariffs, it seems, will hurt our manufacturing and exports. But also, on second thought, our manufacturing, it appears, has been in a slump for some time now. In this episode, we will talk about all of this and more. With us, we have Surajit Mazumdar. He is an economist and teaches in Jawaharlal Nehru University. He specializes in political economy, Indian industrialization, Indian corporate sector, and globalization. Thanks, Surajit, for joining us.
Thank you for having
Uh,
me.
my first question, in very brief for you today, is does the tariffs have the potential to hurt Indian manufacturing and exports? Simply put.
Well, first, let's kind of put this issue of tariffs in context. There are, of course, two parts to the tariffs. One is the general tariffs that have been applied as part of the tariff war against a whole set of countries. And there's a second part that is specifically linked to the issue of imports of Russian oil. Uh, the two are different in terms of what options India has in both cases. But to put the issue in context, India is an economy which, unlike, say, China, uh, is a country which has a perennial trade deficit and a very large trade deficit. And this is accounted for partly by oil, because India doesn't have oil and has to import oil, but it's also accounted for by India's manufacturing trade. And this has been accompanied by a process which we are calling, many people call premature deindustrialization in India, because India is not able to generate through its trade the impetus for industrialization. Now, when it comes to the tariffs from the US, okay, so the tariffs against India are not against an economy which is generating an surplus in general. Instead, India only has a surplus in its foreign currency earnings with the United States, but not with the world as a whole. India's position is that India tends to have large trade deficits with the relatively more industrial economies in the world, whether they are in Europe or they are in East Asia. And it is offsetting part of this deficit by its surplus foreign currency earnings from countries like the United States. With the US, India has a surplus in its goods trade. US is also the major importer of India's IT services, single most important market for the IT services, where again net foreign currency earnings are there. And the United States is also now the single most important source of remittances to India. So we have a surplus foreign currency earnings in transactions with the US, which from our balance of payments perspective are important because we have very large deficits otherwise in relation to our goods trade as well as our so with the mainly in the goods trade and with oil in particular. So for India, there is no resolution of its problem that it can settle with the United States, which is compatible with what the US wants, which is to reduce its deficit with India. For India, that means an aggravation of its deficit, not an erosion of a surplus, but an aggravation of its deficit. For the same reason, India's ability to import oil cheaply from Russia is important to it, because oil is a major source of its deficit. So there is no, it doesn't, so of course, India's industrialization story has so many aspects to it, and it's not that this alone is going to produce the problem. But yes, it will have a disruptive effect. But the point is that this disruption has no resolution or solution for India, which it can deal with the US and work out. And therefore, for India, it is very important to think of some other way of addressing its problems and give up this expectation. That is, you can strike a deal with the US and find a way out of this problem. Because the US wants and what India needs, the two are fundamentally incompatible with each other.
Right. So, just thinking about making a deal by any hook and crook is not something that is fundamentally going to resolve the issue, which goes contrary to what Asha Jadeja Motwani, this Republican American Indian person, business person, is saying that, we need to quickly melt his heart with warmth as Trump is hurt. So, I don't think we can. I mean, in any case, that should be the objective of a sovereign country to melt the hearts of America's presidents. Now, as you said, something related to this question once again, uh, can India make up for its losses in exports? As you said, by trade deficit, you mean that for the audience, it's basically if your imports are more than your exports. And of course, as we can see that the exports sector is going to incur some losses. Now, can India make up for these losses in exports by increasing its domestic consumption? Considering there are talks all around that, we need to focus now inwards and all of that. We saw glimpses of that in the budget also, about talks about, in this turbulent climate, we need to look inwards. But can we actually do that?
Well, so if one thinks of the situation that India is facing, where because the US is the most important source of the surplus, in the short run, there is a lot that India has to lose out of this process. But in the long run, there is no resolution of this problem, which is in India's interests and is compatible with what the United States wants. In the long run, in any case, the resolution of India's industrialization problems lies in being able to use the domestic market as the basis for its industrialization. So we have seen the experience India has had with this attempt to participate in the process of globalization and hope to achieve its industrialization on that basis. So far, what we have seen is that India has not been able to generate export surpluses. Instead, India's manufacturing trade has meant a net kind of loss of markets for Indian manufacturing, and it has contributed to a process of deindustrialization in India. Okay. So if that is the case, then in any case, you should not be thinking that this global scenario or globalization is going to be an answer to the problem. Even if you look at the specific issues that have the hope that India had, that because of the US-China problem, that suddenly a lot of manufacturing would move towards India. That expectation was not being realized, but now that expectation should be thrown out of the window, because the same reason why they have a problem with China, they have a problem with India also. So India is going to be more a victim of that process than a beneficiary of this kind of a thing. That much is clear now. So therefore, India's, in any case, the position was that it should base its industrialization on its potentially large domestic market. Where India has an advantage is because of its size, of the size of its population. Why it is not able to use the domestic market as the basis for its industrialization is that it is seeking to find a place in the world market on the basis of cheap labor. So you want to keep the Indians who labor poor in order to be able to produce cheaply for the world market. You've tried that out, that doesn't work. Then instead of wasting your hope in that, you do things which will enable your own people to buy more and use that as the basis for industrialization. There, India has one great advantage over almost every other country in the world, which is the size of its population. So that is the only way in which India can address the problems of its industrialization and address this problem of the constraints or problems it is facing because of the US policy, because there is no resolution of the problem with the United States that will be in India's interest.
Right. And just to continue the same thought, and as you said, that if we have to shun that path and return to domestic consumption, which also means shunning the path of cheap labor, because if labor remains to be cheap, it cannot afford to buy. So we need to address the demand problem that we have. And if we are seeing that the major manufacturing industries are facing a very strong demand crisis, if you could tell us a little bit about that as well.
So essentially, if you look at the industrial sector's production, what creates demand for it? If you look at the nature of the products, either they are goods intended for consumption, or they are goods that are used when people invest, what do you call capital formation. Now, that capital formation can be things like housing and all of that, which do not lead to any production, just where people stay. Or you can have building of factories, etc., infrastructure, a lot of which also is investment within the industrial sector. Okay. Now, so if you look at it in terms of products, if you look at it in terms of markets, immediate markets either are your domestic market or your export markets. And the market that the government can create or influence is through its own fiscal policy, its taxation and expenditure policies. Now, we have a problem that we are not able to generate enough consumption demand within the economy. We are not able to generate enough export demand in the for Indian manufacturing. And the result of that is because industry or manufacturing is not as attractive sector for investment, we are not generating demand through investment either. Okay. So this is the problem. And this problem means that, of course, your employment growth is limited. Because your employment growth is limited, you still have a labor surplus, large number of unemployed people. This acts as a downward pressure on wages also. So people earn very little and therefore are unable to buy, and this vicious cycle kind of continues. So if you have to break this cycle, obviously people can't suddenly find work on their own with higher wages. That's not, you can't suddenly manufacture exports out of nowhere. So where is your room for action? The room for action is in government policy. That if the government chooses, one, to use its fiscal policy to address the tremendous inequalities in the distribution of income in India, and through higher taxation also expand its expenditures, then that increase in expenditure, and there are very many areas in India where you can expand expenditure, which are extremely limited, which will have the characteristic of both generating employment as well as the characteristic of creating a demand for investment, etc., and all of that, which then will have multiplier effects on the rest of the economy. So that is the direction in which one has to go, in which case one has to give up this fiscal policy being held by this straitjacket, that taxes have to be low, expenditures have to be low, fiscal deficit has to be low, which is part of India's process of insertion into globalization. So somewhere you have to think in terms of creating conditions for a more autonomous path of development, rather than being subject to the whims and fancies of what happens within the global economy, because no matter what you do, Indian political leaders will never have the freedom of Trump to do this or that, that comes from occupying a certain position within the world economy. That's not India's position at all. So India will always be on the receiving end of those things, unless it is able to build its strengths on the basis of a more autonomous path of development.
Right, right. This just brings us to the last question. The reflections of this crisis seem to appear even from the papers that the government or the government institutions are producing. We are seeing that the state of economy in the latest RBI bulletin, it states that as far as manufacturing is concerned, among used-based categories, primary goods, consumer durables, recorded a decline. Now, one of the indicators that is often talked about in the newspapers also is the appetite of demand in the economy का measure के तहत से अगर देखा जाए तो is the production of vehicles, passenger vehicles, either cars or two-wheelers, which also seems to be have dragged down as per the RBI, that the production has slowed, which also shows the state of demand, as you are saying. Um, in that context, what we are also seeing that the government has recently said that it has provided 21,534 crore worth of incentives for the manufacturing. So at one end, the government is saying that ki hum koshish to kar rahe hain. We are giving incentives to the manufacturing industries, to the corporates. There was huge corporate tax rebates that were given, and of course, we take all of those into account. Uh, Now, if you could tell us, is that this involves a lot of public money if you are looking into these incentives and all of that. So, what are your thoughts? Is this the way to boost manufacturing in this country, or what are your?
See, if your fundamental problem is demand, okay, if your fundamental problem is demand, and this problem is got to do with the structure of your domestic market, okay, so those who have the money to afford to buy cars, their purchase of cars are not likely to be significantly altered by whether the car is priced at 10 lakhs or 9 lakh 50,000. Okay. To buy a car, they'll buy a car. Okay. And they are not going to buy more because it has become 9 lakh 50,000 instead of 10 lakh because some subsidy has come from the government which allows the manufacturer to sell it at a lower price. Okay. On the other hand, these subsidies, okay, will not have any impact on the demand of a large range of products, okay, which people with lower incomes have to purchase. Okay. It's not going to solve the fact that they don't have an ability to buy. So the net result is likely to be that manufacturers will take advantage of the subsidy, pocket it, without it having any impact on the production. So the first premise of this policy is wrong. That is that you can address the problem only on the supply side by giving some incentives to manufacturers. You've been given incentives after incentives after incentive. It has not produced a thing because on the other side, there is a problem of demand. So if you have to spend in a way which generates demand. That's the first requirement. And then if you have to give subsidies, you give the subsidies as part of a deliberate strategic intervention in specific core areas and in particularly to smaller and medium scale industries in order to create an appropriate industrial structure which can take the industrialization process forward. That the whole range of, not that there are a few privileged manufacturers who want to corner everything, including the subsidies, and the large, you don't get a wide base of an industrial sector with different sizes for different kinds of products emerging. So subsidies are fine if you use them strategically, but dovetail into a policy where expenditure is used to also expand demand. By itself, these subsidies are only going to get pocketed by the manufacturers and produce no benefit. And you can see the effect. From Make in India till now, what has happened to either India's manufactured exports or to manufacturing production? That these measures are not producing that effect are so visible that, but the problem is that policy is so trapped in a certain mindset that it is so it is always that the concessions are not enough.
Right,
If there
right,
is no response, it is because the concessions are not enough. It becomes a rationale for further concessions. And this is only aggravating the problem rather than resolving it.
right. Thank you so much, Surajit. As you said that instead of trying to kind of kneel in front of this bully or trying to find a sweet deal, we should fundamentally address the concerns regarding manufacturing and industrialization in the country. Thank you so much, Surajit, for being with us.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for
that's,
having me.
yes.